The scent of smoke lingered in the cool morning air as Yates Morgan rode over the crest of the hill, his eyes squinting against the harsh glare of the rising sun. What he saw below made him pull his horse to an abrupt halt, a charred skeleton of what had once been a barn, still smoldering in places, with a slender figure curled up asleep against one of the few remaining walls. Wyoming Territory, 1878, was no place for a woman alone, especially one sleeping in the shadow of destruction. Yates guided his horse down the slope, careful not to make too much noise. As he approached, he could see she was young, perhaps in her mid-20s, with ash-streaked auburn hair that had come loose from what might have once been a tidy bun. Her dress, though dirty and torn in places, spoke of someone who'd known better days. He dismounted a respectful distance away, but the sound of his boots hitting the hard, packed earth was enough to startle her awake. She bolted upright, eyes wild with fear, clutching a small knife that had been hidden in the folds of her skirt. "Easy now," Yates said, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "I'm not here to hurt you, madam." The woman's green eyes narrowed as she assessed him, taking in his worn leather vest, the six-shooter at his hip, and his sun-weathered face partially hidden beneath several days' worth of stubble. "What do you want?" Her voice was hoarse, likely from smoke or crying or both, but there was a strength to it that surprised him. "Nothing, madam, just passing through and saw the smoke. Thought someone might need help." He gestured to the ruins of the barn. "What happened here?" She lowered the knife slightly but kept it firmly in her grasp. "Raiders, middle of the night, they took the horses, burned the barn." Her gaze drifted to a small farmhouse about 100 yards away that appeared untouched. "My brother's place, he's gone east for supplies. Won't be back for weeks." Yates nodded slowly, noting the slight tremor in her hand and the dark circles under her eyes. She was lying about something, but he couldn't blame her for being cautious. "My name's Yates Morgan," he offered, removing his hat. "And you are?" She hesitated, then seemed to decide that giving her name wouldn't put her in any more danger than she was already in. "Katherine Donovan, most call me Kate." "Well, Miss Kate, seems to me you could use some help rebuilding that barn before your brother returns." Her eyebrows rose in surprise. "And why would a stranger offer to do that?" Yates smiled slightly, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "Because even strangers should lend a hand when it's needed. Besides," he added, looking at the destroyed structure, "I've built a few barns in my time." She stared at him for a long moment, clearly weighing her options. Finally, she slipped the knife back into its hiding place and stood, brushing ash from her skirt. "I can't pay you," she said bluntly, not asking for payment. He turned to his horse and began unstrapping his bedroll. "Just offering to help." Kate's gaze followed his movements, suspicion still evident in her posture. "Just like that, you'll help rebuild an entire barn for nothing?" Yates looked back at the smoldering ruins, then at the proud but clearly exhausted woman before him. Something about her called to him a resilience he admired, perhaps, or the quiet dignity with which she faced her circumstances. "Let's build it back together," he said simply. "4 hands work faster than 2. The words hung between them as the morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the scorched earth. After what seemed like an eternity, Kate gave a single, decisive nod. "I'll get breakfast started," she said, turning toward the house. "You can tether your horse by the water pump." Yates watched her walk away, back straight despite everything. He hadn't planned on staying anywhere for long, hadn't stayed in one place for more than a few weeks since the war ended, but something told him this stop might be different. By the time he'd seen to his horse and washed up at the pump, the smell of coffee and frying bacon had replaced the acrid scent of smoke in the air. He made his way to the modest farmhouse, noting the care with which it had been maintained. The porch was swept clean, the windows intact and gleaming in the morning light. A stark contrast to the devastation just yards away. Kate stood at the stove when he entered, her hair now neatly pinned back and her face freshly washed. She didn't look at him as she slid eggs onto 2 plates. "Sit," she instructed, nodding toward a simple wooden table. Yates removed his hat and took a seat, studying the interior of the home. It was clean and orderly, with a few touches that suggested a woman's presence: a vase of wildflowers on the sideboard, hand-stitched curtains at the windows. But there were masculine elements too: a rifle mounted above the door, spurs hanging from a hook by the entrance. "Your brother's place is nice," he commented, accepting the plate she handed him. Kate paused before sitting down across from him. "Thank you." They ate in silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the clink of forks against plates and the distant call of meadowlarks outside. "Why are you really here, Mr. Morgan?" Kate finally asked, setting down her fork. "Men don't just offer to rebuild barns for strangers without wanting something in return." Yates met her gaze steadily. "Some do. Besides, I needed somewhere to stay for a while. Working for my keep seems fair, and after the barn is built, I'll move on. Always do." He took a sip of coffee. "Now, why don't you tell me what really happened to that barn? Raiders don't usually just take horses and burn buildings without doing more damage." Kate's hand tightened around her cup. "What makes you think I wasn't telling the truth?" "Experience," he replied simply. "And the fact that your house is untouched." She stared at him for a long moment, then sighed. "It wasn't raiders, it was Emmett Doyle and his men." Yates frowned. The name was familiar. "The rancher who's been buying up all the small properties around here." Kate nodded. "He wants this land. Says it's the best access to Clear Creek for miles. My brother refused to sell, so Doyle's been applying pressure." "And where is your brother really?" Her eyes dropped to her plate. "Dead, 3 months ago, caught a fever after getting thrown from his horse during a storm." The weight of her solitude hit Yates like a physical blow. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "Why stay here alone? Where would I go?" She looked up, her green eyes challenging. "This is my home now. I'm not letting Doyle take it." Yates nodded slowly. "Brave, but dangerous. Men like Doyle don't give up easily." "Neither do I." She stood and began clearing the plates. "If you still want to help rebuild the barn, I'll be grateful. If not, I understand." Yates watched her move efficiently around the small kitchen, her determination evident in every gesture. He'd planned to keep riding, to outrun memories that pursued him like shadows. But the thought of leaving this woman alone to face Emmett Doyle didn't sit right with him. "I'll start salvaging what I can from the barn," he said, rising from his chair. "We'll need to make a list of lumber and supplies." The look of relief that flashed across her face was brief but unmistakable. "Thank you, Mr. Morgan." "Yates," he corrected. "If we're going to be building a barn together, you might as well use my given name." A small smile touched her lips. "Yates, then, and I'm Kate." The day passed in a blur of hard work. Yates cleared away charred debris while Kate brought him water and helped sort through the wreckage for anything salvageable. By mid-afternoon, they had a rough estimate of what they'd need to rebuild. "We'll have to go into town tomorrow," Yates said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Get lumber, nails, maybe hire a wagon to haul it all back." Kate looked uneasy. "I haven't been to town since Thomas died. People talk." "About what? A woman living alone. It's not proper." She twisted her hands in her apron. "And Doyle has friends there." Yates considered this. "Then I'll go alone, but I'll need money for supplies." Kate led him back to the house and opened a small tin box hidden behind a loose brick in the fireplace. Inside was a modest stack of bills and coins. "It's everything Thomas and I saved," she explained. "I was keeping it for, well, I don't know what for anymore." Yates took only what he calculated they'd need. "I'll be careful with it," he promised. That evening, after a simple supper, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. The burned barn stood as a stark silhouette against the colorful backdrop. "How did you learn to build barns?" Kate asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. Yates leaned back in his chair. "Grew up on a farm in Missouri, built my first barn with my pa when I was 12. After that, seemed like every neighbor for miles wanted our help with theirs." "Your family's still there?" He shook his head. "Lost them during the war. Union soldiers burned everything, took what they wanted. Not much different from what Doyle did to you." Kate's expression softened with understanding. "I'm sorry. It was a long time ago." Yates gazed out at the horizon. "What about you?" "You always lived in Wyoming. No, we came from Illinois 5 years ago. Thomas fought for the Union, came home changed, wanted open spaces, room to breathe. Our parents had died, so there was nothing keeping us there. She traced a pattern on the wooden armrest of her chair. He was all I had left. Yates heard the grief in her voice, raw and recent. It gets easier, he said quietly. Not better, but easier. She looked at him then, really looked at him, as if seeing past the trail dust and the hard exterior to the man beneath. Does it? I keep waiting. It does, he assured her. One day you'll wake up and the first thing you think about won't be that they're gone. It'll be something else, the work that needs doing, the weather, a book you're reading. Kate nodded slowly. I hope you're right. As darkness fell, they retreated inside. Yates insisted on sleeping in the barn loft, what remained of it, despite Kate's offer of the spare room. It wouldn't do to give neighbors more to gossip about, he'd explained, and she'd conceded the point with a grateful look. In the pre-dawn light the next day, Yates rode into the town of Clearwater, a small but growing settlement about 5 miles from Kate's farm. The main street was already bustling with morning activity, storekeepers opening up, ranch hands heading to the saloon after night shifts, a stagecoach being readied for its journey east. He tied his horse outside the general store and stepped inside, the bell above the door announcing his arrival. The shopkeeper, a round man with spectacles perched on his nose, looked up from his ledger. Morning, stranger. What can I help you with? Need supplies for barn building, Yates replied, placing his list on the counter. Lumber, nails, tools, rope, the shopkeeper whistled. That's quite an order, building from scratch, rebuilding. Fire took the original. Wouldn't happen to be working for the Donovan place, would you? When Yates's expression remained neutral, the man continued. Only heard about a barn fire out that way yesterday. Shame about Thomas Donovan. Good man, left his sister in a tough spot, though. Yates recognized the fishing for information. Just passing through, offering help where it's needed. Noble of you, the shopkeeper remarked, though his tone suggested skepticism. Well, I can get most of this together for you. Might take a couple hours, and you'll need a wagon. Can you arrange one, for a fee? The man named his price, which was higher than Yates expected but still within their budget. While waiting for the supplies to be gathered, Yates visited the saloon for a quick meal. He'd just finished his stew when a shadow fell across his table. Here you're helping out at the Donovan place. Yates looked up to see a tall man in expensive clothes, flanked by 2 rougher-looking companions. The way they positioned themselves, blocking easy exit, hands near their weapons, told Yates all he needed to know about their intentions. News travels fast, Yates replied calmly, wiping his mouth with a napkin. Small town, the man said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Emmett Doyle. I own the Double D Ranch, Yates Morgan. He didn't offer his hand. Doyle didn't seem bothered by the lack of courtesy. That Donovan place is a nice little property, good water access, been trying to buy it for some time, so I've heard. The girl's alone now. No way she can maintain it herself. It would be better for everyone if she sold. Yates took a slow sip of his coffee. Seems to me that's her decision to make. Doyle's smile tightened. Of course, but sometimes people need guidance to make the right choice. A friendly word from someone who cares about her welfare might help. I'll keep that in mind, Yates said, rising from his chair. He dropped coins on the table to pay for his meal. If you'll excuse me, I have supplies to collect. As he moved to pass, one of Doyle's men shifted to block his path. Yates stopped, his hand casually resting near his holster. Something else, he asked quietly. Doyle studied him for a moment, then nodded to his man, who stepped aside. Just a friendly warning, Morgan. Don't get too comfortable at the Donovan place. It won't be hers for long. Yates held the rancher's gaze. We'll see. By early afternoon, Yates was driving a wagon loaded with supplies back to Kate's farm. As he approached, he saw her emerge from the house, shading her eyes against the sun. The relief on her face when she recognized him was unmistakable. I was beginning to worry, she admitted as he brought the wagon to a stop near the burned barn site. Took longer than expected, he explained, jumping down from the driver's seat. Met your friend Doyle. Kate's expression hardened. What did he want? To let me know he still wants your land. Yates began unloading planks of lumber. Suggested I might persuade you to sell, and will you? There was a challenge in her voice. Yates looked at her directly. Not my place to tell you what to do with your property, Kate, but I will tell you to be careful. Men like Doyle don't take kindly to being denied what they want. She nodded, seemingly satisfied with his answer, and moved to help him unload. Together, they sorted the supplies and began planning the new barn's foundation. Over the next 2 weeks, they fell into a rhythm. Each day began before dawn, with Kate preparing breakfast while Yates tended to his horse and checked their progress from the day before. They worked side by side under the relentless Wyoming sun, stopping only for quick meals and water breaks. Kate proved to be a capable worker, her slender frame belying considerable strength and determination. She learned quickly, following Yates's instructions and soon anticipating his needs before he voiced them. As they worked, they talked. Kate shared stories of her childhood in Illinois, of her brother's dreams for their Wyoming homestead, of the small victories and setbacks they'd experienced in their 5 years on the land. Yates was more reticent at first, offering brief anecdotes about his life before the war, careful to avoid mention of the years that followed. But as days passed and walls began to rise from the ashes of the old barn, other walls, the invisible ones between them, began to lower. You've done this before, Kate observed one evening as they sat on the porch, their bodies aching from the day's labor. Not just building barns, but helping people. Yates raised an eyebrow. What makes you say that, the way you work? Methodical, like you're following a plan that's bigger than just this barn. She turned to look at him, her face soft in the fading light. And sometimes I catch you watching the horizon like you're expecting trouble. He was quiet for a long moment. After the war, I drifted. Did odd jobs, mostly for widows and families who'd lost men to the fighting. Both sides, he added. Grief doesn't care which uniform you wore. That's unusual for a former soldier. Maybe, he stared into the growing darkness. Seemed like the only way to make sense of surviving when so many didn't. Kate's hand moved across the space between their chairs, coming to rest lightly on his arm. I'm glad you survived, Yates Morgan. The simple touch and sincere words caught him off guard. How long had it been since anyone had expressed gratitude for his existence? Not for his labor or his gun, but simply for his being alive. Thank you, he managed, his voice rougher than he intended. They sat in companionable silence until the stars emerged, pinpricks of light in the vast Wyoming sky. The next morning, they were startled by the approach of riders, 3 men from Doyle's ranch, leading a small herd of cattle that they deliberately drove across the edge of Kate's property, trampling a section of vegetable garden she'd carefully tended. Yates stepped forward as the men circled back, his hand resting casually near his gun. Mighty careless with those cattle, he called out. The lead rider, a wiry man with a pockmarked face, grinned unpleasantly. Accidents happen, especially on disputed land. This land isn't disputed, Kate said firmly, coming to stand beside Yates. It belongs to me and you know it. For now, maybe. The rider spat tobacco juice onto the ground. But Mr. Doyle's patience is wearing thin, Miss Donovan. You'd be wise to reconsider his offer before more accidents occur. Yates took a step forward. You've delivered your message, now get off this property. The men exchanged glances, clearly assessing whether to push further. Whatever they saw in Yates's steady gaze convinced them to retreat for now. We'll be seeing you, the leader promised as they rode away. When they were out of earshot, Kate turned to Yates, her face pale but determined. They'll be back with more men. Probably, he agreed. We should prepare. That afternoon, they adjusted their work plan, prioritizing a defensive position. Yates showed Kate how to use her brother's rifle and made sure she had ammunition within easy reach both in the house and near their work site. They constructed sections of the barn wall that could provide cover if needed and established signals to alert each other to approaching riders. As they worked, Yates found himself watching Kate with growing admiration. Most people would have broken under the strain of loss, isolation, and threat. Yet here she was, driving nails with precise strikes, lifting her share of the load, planning their defense with clear-eyed pragmatism. "My brother would like you," she said unexpectedly as they paused for water. "He always said he wished I'd find a man who could work as hard as I do." Yates nearly choked on his drink. "Is that what I am, a man you found?" A blush colored her cheeks, but she didn't look away. "I didn't mean. That is, I know you're just passing through." Something twisted in Yates's chest, regret perhaps, or a longing he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge. "Right," he said quietly, "just passing through." The moment hung between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Then Kate squared her shoulders and picked up her hammer again. "We should finish this section before dark," she said, her tone deliberately casual. Yates nodded, following her lead back to work, though his thoughts remained tangled in what might have been. That night, rain swept across the plains, a powerful summer storm that turned the worksite to mud and forced them to seek shelter in the house. They sat at the kitchen table, a lantern between them, as thunder rattled the windows and lightning illuminated the room in stark flashes. "At least the wood's covered," Kate said, sipping a cup of tea. "We won't lose too much work." Yates nodded, watching her across the table. With her hair down from its usual practical bun, falling in soft waves around her shoulders, she looked younger, more vulnerable. Yet the steel in her eyes remained. "Can I ask you something?" he said suddenly. She looked up, surprised by his serious tone. "Of course." "Why fight so hard for this place? You could sell to Doyle, go back east, start fresh somewhere safer." Kate set down her cup, considering her answer. This land was Thomas's dream. He saw something here that no one else did: potential, beauty, a future. She glanced around the modest kitchen. "But it's become my dream too. I love the open sky, the way the grass moves like water in the wind, the silence that isn't really silence if you listen carefully." She met his eyes directly. "And I refuse to be chased away by a man who thinks his money and threats give him the right to take what isn't his." Yates nodded slowly. "Good answer." A particularly loud thunderclap made Kate jump slightly, and Yates found himself reaching across the table to cover her hand with his own. The touch was meant to be reassuring, but the moment their skin connected, something electric passed between them that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Kate's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she turned her hand to lace her fingers with his, the gesture both innocent and impossibly intimate. "Thank you," she said softly, "for staying, for helping." "Kate," he began, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite name. The window exploded inward in a shower of glass and splintered wood. Kate screamed as Yates lunged across the table, pulling her to the floor as more shots rang out, shattering the lantern and plunging the room into darkness broken only by flashes of lightning. "Stay down." Yates commanded, drawing his pistol. He crawled to the wall beside the window, careful to remain below the sill. "Do you have a back door?" "Yes, off the kitchen," Kate replied, her voice remarkably steady despite the danger. "When I start shooting, run for it. Get to the trees behind the house." "I'll find you." Kate gripped his arm. "Not without you." Another volley of shots tore through the house, one bullet embedding itself in the floor inches from where they crouched. "We don't have time to argue," Yates hissed. "I'll be right behind you, now go." He rose enough to fire 3 rapid shots through the broken window, then 2 more at a different angle. The return fire paused momentarily, enough time for Kate to scramble to her feet and dash for the kitchen. Yates continued providing cover, moving from window to window, making it seem as though multiple defenders were inside. When he judged enough time had passed for Kate to reach safety, he retreated to the back door himself, keeping low and moving fast. The rain had intensified, turning the yard to a sea of mud that sucked at his boots as he ran for the tree line. Lightning flashed, momentarily illuminating the landscape, and he caught a glimpse of Kate's pale dress among the trees. He reached her side, breathless and dripping. "Are you hurt?" "No," she whispered, clutching his arm. "Who's shooting at us?" "Doyle's men, most likely." Yates peered through the curtain of rain toward the house, where shadowy figures were now visible moving on the porch. "They're getting bolder." "What do we do?" Yates assessed their options quickly. "We need to get to higher ground, somewhere defensible where we can see them coming." Kate nodded, her wet hair plastered to her face. There's an old line shack about a mile east on a rise overlooking the creek. Thomas used it for hunting. Lead the way." They moved through the darkness, the rain providing cover for their escape, but making the journey treacherous. Kate stumbled several times on the slick ground, and Yates caught her, his arm eventually finding its way around her waist to steady her. The line shack was little more than a one-room shelter with a small stove, a narrow cot, and a few basic supplies. But it was dry, defensible, and as Kate had said, positioned with a good view of the surrounding terrain. Yates secured the door behind them while Kate fumbled to light a small lamp she found on a shelf. The warm glow revealed their bedraggled state, both soaked to the skin, muddy, and in Kate's case, with small cuts on her arms and face from the shattered glass. "Let me see those," Yates said, gently taking her arm to examine the cuts. "They're nothing," she protested, but allowed him to guide her to the cot. He found a canteen of water and a relatively clean cloth, using it to dab at the worst of the cuts. Kate winced slightly but remained still under his ministrations. "I'm sorry," he said quietly as he worked. "I brought this on you." Kate frowned. "How do you figure that?" Doyle was content with intimidation before. Now he's escalated to shooting up your house. Yates's jaw tightened. "Because I'm here, because he sees me as a threat. Or because he was always going to escalate eventually," Kate countered. "You being here just gave me a fighting chance." Their eyes met in the lamplight, and Yates was struck by the fierce conviction in her gaze. Without thinking, he reached up to brush a strand of wet hair from her cheek, his fingertips lingering against her skin. Kate's breath caught audibly, her eyes widening slightly at the contact. For a long moment, neither moved, caught in a fragile balance between propriety and desire. Then a crash of thunder broke the spell, and Yates pulled back, clearing his throat. "You should try to get some rest," he said, rising from the cot. "I'll keep watch." Kate looked as though she might argue, but exhaustion won out. She nodded, settling back onto the narrow cot while Yates positioned himself by the window, watching the rain-soaked landscape for any sign of pursuit. As the night wore on, the storm gradually subsided, leaving behind a world washed clean and gleaming in the moonlight that occasionally broke through the thinning clouds. Yates remained vigilant, his thoughts as turbulent as the weather had been. He hadn't planned on this, on becoming entangled in another person's fight, on caring what happened to a piece of land that wasn't his, on feeling his heart stir for the first time in years. The smart play would be to leave at first light, to continue his solitary journey before he became any more involved. But as he glanced at Kate's sleeping form, peaceful despite everything, he knew he wouldn't go. Couldn't go. Not until she was safe, her land secure, her barn rebuilt. Not until he understood what this pull toward her might mean, if given a chance to grow. Dawn broke with a clarity that only follows heavy rain, the air scrubbed clean and sweet. Kate stirred as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the small window, sitting up with momentary disorientation before her eyes found Yates. "You didn't sleep," she observed, concern in her voice. He shrugged. "Wasn't tired." Kate rose from the cot, smoothing her wrinkled, now dry dress as best she could. "Have you seen any sign of them?" "No, but that doesn't mean they're not looking." Yates moved away from the window, rolling his shoulders to ease the stiffness from his night-long vigil. "We need a plan." Kate nodded, her expression determined. "We can't hide forever, and I won't abandon my home." "No," Yates agreed, "but we can't just walk back in either. Doyle's crossed a line, he won't stop now." They discussed options over a meager breakfast of jerky and stale biscuits found in the cabin's supplies. By the time they'd finished, a strategy had emerged risky, but with a chance of success. "We'll need help," Yates concluded. "Are there any neighbors you trust?" "Anyone who might stand with us against Doyle," Kate considered this. "The Hendersons, maybe. Their place is about 3 miles north, and the Wilsons to the west. They've had their own troubles with Doyle trying to buy them out." "Good, I'll go to them, see if they'll join us." "You stay here where it's safe," Kate shook her head firmly. "No, we go together or not at all. Besides," she added with a hint of a smile, "they're more likely to help if I ask." Yates wanted to argue but recognized the truth in her words and the steel in her spine that told him argument would be futile. "Fine, but we move carefully, stay off the main trails." They set out mid-morning, keeping to wooded areas and low gullies where possible. Kate led the way, her knowledge of the land proving invaluable as they made their way to the Henderson homestead. The Hendersons, a grizzled farmer named Jacob, his stout wife Mabel, and their 2 grown sons received them with concern and immediate offers of help. "Doyle's been pushing everyone too far for too long," Jacob declared as Mabel served coffee and fresh bread at their kitchen table. "Man thinks he can buy the whole territory, or take what he can't buy," his elder son, Robert, added grimly. By mid-afternoon, they had visited the Wilsons as well, securing promises of support from that family and learning of 2 other homesteaders who had grievances against Doyle. "That gives us 7 men with guns," Yates calculated as they made their way back toward the line shack. "Not counting you," he added with a nod to Kate. "8 counting me," she corrected. "I can shoot." Yates didn't doubt it. 8 then, against however many Doyle can muster. "He has 15 hands, maybe 20, Kate said, "but not all will be willing to risk murder charges. Some are just cowhands earning a wage." Yates nodded thoughtfully. "We don't need to defeat his whole outfit, just convince him that taking your land isn't worth the cost." They spent the night at the line shack again, with plans to gather their allies and move on Kate's house at dawn. As darkness fell, a new tension settled between them, not fear of Doyle but awareness of each other, of the small space they shared, of unspoken feelings growing stronger with each passing hour. "Why did you really stay?" Kate asked as they sat by the small stove, the flickering light casting dancing shadows on the walls. "You could have ridden on when you realized the trouble I was in. Most men would have." Yates looked at her across the small space, seeing the genuine curiosity in her eyes. "I told myself it was because it was the right thing to do," he said slowly. "That helping you rebuild was, I don't know, making amends somehow for things I couldn't change in the past. And now," her voice was soft, barely audible over the crackle of the fire, "now I know it was more than that." He held her gaze steadily. "I stayed because something about you called to me, Kate, your courage, your determination, the way you refused to be beaten by circumstances that would break most people." He paused, searching for words. "I've been drifting for years, never staying anywhere long, never letting myself get attached. But here with you, for the first time since the war, I've felt like I might have a purpose beyond just surviving day to day." Kate's eyes glistened in the firelight. "And what purpose is that?" Yates moved from his seat to kneel before her, taking her hands in his. "To stand beside you, to help you build something lasting, too." He took a deep breath. "To see if what I'm feeling, what I think we're both feeling, could grow into something real." Kate's fingers tightened around his. "It already is real," she whispered, "at least for me." The admission hung in the air between them, fragile and precious. Then, with a courage that matched everything else about her, Kate leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but quickly deepened as Yates responded, one hand moving to cradle her face while the other remained clasped with hers. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. "Kate," Yates murmured, resting his forehead against hers. "If we survive tomorrow, if we manage to keep your land and finish that barn, I'd like to stay, not just passing through, really stay." She smiled, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I'd like that too, very much." They spent the night side by side on the narrow cot, not in passion but in comfort, holding each other against the uncertainty of the coming day. Yates listened to Kate's breathing as it slowed into sleep, his arm around her waist, her head tucked against his shoulder. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine a future one with roots and purpose, with someone to build for rather than memories to run from. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, but first, they had to survive what morning would bring. Dawn came with a clarity that matched their resolve. They set out early, meeting their allies at a designated spot a half-mile from Kate's property. Jacob Henderson and his sons, the Wilson brothers, and 2 other local farmers had answered their call, all armed, all grim-faced with determination. "Doyle's men were at your place again yesterday," Robert Henderson informed them. tore up what was left of the barn site, looked like they were settling in to wait for you to return. Yates nodded, unsurprised. How many? 5 that I saw, could be more inside the house. They formulated their plan: quickly surround the property, show their strength, demand Doyle's men leave. Avoid bloodshed if possible, but be prepared to defend themselves if necessary. As they approached through the morning mist, Kate gasped at the sight of her home. The front windows were boarded over with mismatched planks, a crude barricade had been erected on the porch, and the barn site was indeed in shambles, their careful work of the past weeks destroyed. Anger flashed in her eyes, but Yates touched her arm gently. "Remember the plan," he murmured. "Property can be rebuilt, lives can't." She nodded, though the set of her jaw told him her anger hadn't abated. They spread out as arranged, creating a perimeter around the house. Yates and Kate approached from the front in plain sight, while the others maintained positions of cover with clear lines of fire. "Hello, the house," Yates called when they were within earshot. "We know you're in there. Come out where we can talk." There was a moment of silence, then the front door creaked open. A man Yates recognized as one of Doyle's companions from the saloon appeared, rifle in hand. "Well, look who's back," he drawled. "Brought the girl with you too. Mr. Doyle will be pleased." "Mr. Doyle isn't here." Kate asked, surprised. The man laughed. "Boss doesn't get his hands dirty, sent us to wait for you, said you'd be back eventually." His eyes narrowed. "Now drop those guns and come on in, we got plenty to discuss." "I don't think so," Yates replied calmly. "You're trespassing on Miss Donovan's property. You and your friends need to leave. Now." The man's laugh turned ugly. "And who's gonna make us? You and the girl?" "Us," came Jacob Henderson's voice as he and his sons emerged from cover to the left. The Wilsons appeared to the right, and the other farmers moved into view from various positions. The man in the doorway paled visibly, his rifle wavering. "This ain't your fight, Henderson. When you shoot up a neighbor's house, it becomes everyone's fight," Jacob replied steadily. "Now you call your boys out, nice and easy, and ride back to Doyle. Tell him if he wants this land, he'll have to go through all of us." For a tense moment, it seemed the standoff might erupt into violence. Then the door opened wider and 4 more men emerged, weapons lowered. "This ain't over," their leader muttered as they moved toward their horses. "Doyle won't stand for this." "Then Doyle can come talk to me himself," Kate said, stepping forward. "In daylight, like a civilized man, not sending hired guns to shoot up my home in the night." The men mounted up, casting dark looks at the assembled farmers, and rode off toward Doyle's ranch. A cheer went up from their allies, but Yates kept his eyes on the retreating riders. "It's not over," he said quietly to Kate. "This was too easy." Kate nodded, her expression sober despite the victory. Doyle won't give up. They spent the day repairing what damage they could to the house, their friends staying to help before returning to their own farms with promises to come running if needed. By sunset, the broken windows were boarded more neatly, the mess inside cleaned up, and the barn site re-cleared for construction. "We should start fresh tomorrow," Yates suggested as they sat on the newly repaired porch steps, watching the sun sink below the horizon. "Get the foundation set properly." Kate leaned against his shoulder, her exhaustion evident. "If Doyle lets us." "He'll come himself next time," Yates predicted. "He'll want to see who's defying him." "Let him come," Kate said with quiet determination. "This is my land." "Our land," she amended, glancing up at Yates. The simple inclusion sent warmth spreading through his chest. He turned to kiss her forehead, then her lips, gentle but full of promise. "Our land," he agreed. "Our barn, our future." They spent a watchful night, taking turns keeping guard, but no riders appeared. In the morning, they began work on the barn foundation anew, digging post holes and setting corner markers with practiced efficiency. They were so absorbed in their work that they almost missed the approach of a large group of riders until the thunder of hooves was nearly upon them. Yates straightened, hand moving to his gun as a dozen men on horseback crested the rise. At their head rode Emmett Doyle himself, distinguished from his men by his fine clothes and the silver-trimmed saddle of his horse. He reined in about 20 yards away, his expression a mixture of anger and calculation. "Miss Donovan," he called, removing his hat in a mockery of politeness. "I see you've acquired some help." Kate moved to stand beside Yates, her head high. "Mr. Doyle, what brings you to my property?" "Your property," Doyle repeated, his tone making the words an insult. "This land should be part of the Double D. It's the only thing separating my north and south pastures. You're one woman alone, what can you do with it?" "She's not alone," Yates said quietly, his hand never straying far from his holster. Doyle's gaze shifted to him, assessing. "The drifter. My men told me about you. What's your stake in this, I wonder? Looking to marry into some land?" The crude suggestion made Kate stiffen beside him, but Yates kept his expression neutral. "My reasons are my own, but I'm staying. As are our neighbors," Kate added. "The Hendersons, the Wilsons, they all stand with me." "How many of your men are willing to die for a piece of land that isn't even yours, Mr. Doyle?" The rancher's face darkened at the challenge. "You threatening me, girl?" "Not threatening. Stating facts." Kate's voice remained steady. "This is my land. I'm not selling, not to you, not to anyone. You can accept that and be a neighbor, or you can keep pushing and find out just how much trouble a woman and her friends can cause you." The standoff stretched, tension vibrating in the air like heat waves. Yates calculated their odds 2 against 12, even with the advantage of defensive position, weren't good. But he'd faced worse and survived. Then, surprisingly, Doyle laughed. Not a pleasant sound, but genuine amusement nonetheless. "You've got spirit, I'll give you that," he said to Kate. "More than your brother ever did." Kate's hands clenched at the mention of Thomas, but she remained silent. Doyle surveyed the partially rebuilt barn, the repaired house, the freshly dug post holes. "You really think you can make a go of this place? 2 people against everything nature and man can throw at you?" "We do," Yates said simply. Doyle studied them for another long moment, then nodded as if coming to a decision. "Tell you what, Miss Donovan, I won't try to buy your land again for now. Let's see if you and your friend can actually build something here. If you're still standing come winter, maybe we can discuss water rights instead. My cattle need access to that creek." Kate exchanged a glance with Yates, then nodded cautiously. "Water rights can be negotiated, fairly." "Fair," Doyle repeated, as if testing an unfamiliar word. "We'll see about that." He settled his hat back on his head. "Good day to you both." With that, he wheeled his horse around and rode off, his men following after, casting curious glances at the couple who had dared to stand against their boss. When they were out of sight, Kate let out a breath she seemed to have been holding. "Do you think he means it, about leaving us alone?" Yates considered this. "For now, yes, he's a businessman at heart. He's decided the cost of taking your land by force is too high compared to what he'd gain. But he'll be watching, waiting for us to fail." "Then we won't fail," Yates said simply, turning back to the post hole he'd been digging. "We'll build something so strong he'll never think to challenge it again." Kate smiled, the tension leaving her shoulders as she picked up her own shovel. Together, the weeks that followed passed in a blur of hard work and quiet joy. The barn took shape gradually, first the framework, then the walls, finally the roof. Neighbors helped when they could, bringing food and extra hands for the heavier tasks. As summer turned to early fall, Kate and Yates developed a rhythm to their days that felt as natural as breathing. They rose with the sun, worked until dusk, and spent evenings planning the next day's tasks or simply sitting on the porch, watching stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky. And in those quiet moments, their bond deepened. What had begun as mutual respect grew into admiration, then affection, then a love so profound it sometimes left Yates breathless with its intensity. One evening in late September, with the barn nearly complete except for some interior work, Yates found Kate standing in the doorway of the new structure, gazing at their handiwork with evident satisfaction. "It's better than the original," she said as he came to stand beside her. "Stronger." "Like its owner," Yates replied, slipping an arm around her waist. She leaned into his embrace, her head resting against his shoulder. "I couldn't have done this without you. You would have found a way," he said, believing it, "but I'm glad you didn't have to." Kate turned in his arms to face him, her expression suddenly serious. "Are you really staying, Yates, for good?" He met her gaze steadily. "As long as you'll have me. That might be a very long time." There was a hint of vulnerability in her voice that tugged at his heart. In answer, Yates reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, a simple gold band he'd purchased on his last trip to town, carrying it with him for days waiting for the right moment. "I was hoping," he said quietly, "it might be forever." Kate's eyes widened as she took in the ring. "Yates, I know it's fast," he continued, suddenly uncertain. "We've only known each other a few months. If you need more time," she stopped his words with a kiss fierce and certain. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "It's not too fast. Not when you know, really know, that you've found where you belong." Yates slipped the ring onto her finger, his own hands trembling slightly with emotion he'd never expected to feel again, or perhaps had never truly felt before. "I love you, Kate Donovan," he said, the words simple but carrying the weight of absolute truth. "And I love you, Yates Morgan." She looked down at the ring, then back at his face. "Though I suppose soon I'll be Kate Morgan." "Has a nice sound to it," he agreed, pulling her close again. That night they sat on the porch steps, Kate's head on Yates's shoulder, his arm around her waist, the new ring catching the last rays of the setting sun. Before them stood the nearly completed barn, solid and strong against the backdrop of mountains and endless sky. "When I found you sleeping beside that burned barn," Yates said softly, "I never imagined we'd end up here." Kate smiled, nestling closer to his side. "When you said let's build it back together, I think part of me knew." "Knew what?" "That we weren't just talking about the barn." She looked up at him, her expression serene in the fading light. "We were building a life." Yates kissed her then, a gentle promise sealed as the first stars appeared above them. 2 months later, on a crisp November morning, Kate and Yates were married in the newly completed barn, surrounded by the neighbors who had become their friends and allies. The Reverend Jenkins from Clearwater performed the ceremony, smiling broadly as the couple exchanged vows beneath rafters they had raised together. Even Emmett Doyle attended, standing at the back with a grudging respect in his eyes. After the ceremony, he approached the newlyweds with a surprising gesture, a deed for water rights that allowed his cattle-controlled access to the creek while protecting Kate's homestead. "Consider it a wedding gift," he said gruffly. "A man should respect those who stand their ground." With a nod to Yates and a tip of his hat to Kate, he departed, leaving them to their celebration. The barn, decorated with lanterns and late autumn flowers, echoed with music and laughter long into the evening. When the last guests had gone, Yates swept Kate into his arms and carried her across the threshold of their home, no longer just her brother's place, but truly theirs. In the years that followed, the Morgan homestead flourished. They added a small herd of cattle, expanded the vegetable garden, and in the 3rd year, welcomed twins, a boy they named Thomas after Kate's brother, and a girl they called Mary for Yates's mother. The barn stood strong through blizzards and summer storms, housing animals, equipment, and occasionally serving as a gathering place for community celebrations. On its eastern wall, Kate painted the date of the fire, and below it, the date of its completion, a reminder of destruction and renewal. Sometimes, on summer evenings when the children were asleep, Kate and Yates would sit on the porch steps, just as they had that first summer, watching fireflies rise from the tall grass and stars emerge in the darkening sky. "You ever think about that morning?" Kate asked once. "When you found me beside the burned barn," Yates took her hand, running his thumb over the simple gold band that had been joined by a wedding ring. "I think about how close I came to riding past, how different our lives would have been." "I like to think we would have found each other somehow," Kate said, leaning against his shoulder. "That some things are meant to be like us," Yates agreed, kissing the top of her head. "Like us," echoed the Wyoming wind, carrying their words across the land they had defended, the home they had built, the life they had created together.